I've been working overnight freight receiving at a distribution center for about 14 months now. It's not the kind of job you brag about at family dinners, but it pays better than most people expect. And there's something I've always liked about the night, the quiet, the sense that the rest of the world has clocked out and it's just you and the work. I run the loading dock from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., logging inbound deliveries, scanning pallets, coordinating with the third-party carriers who roll in at all hours. Sometimes it's busy. Mostly it isn't. The facility is a large distribution hub for a grocery chain. Refrigerated sections, dry goods, a separate freezer unit at the back. The building itself is probably 60,000 square feet of floor space, and during the day it's loud and populated and very normal. At night, though, with most of the overhead lighting cut to half power and the ambient hum of the refrigeration units filling every silence, it has a particular atmosphere that takes getting used to. I used to call it the submarine when I talked to my wife on my lunch break. Everything is enclosed and pressurized and slightly too quiet. My name is Derek, and I want to be clear about something before I start. I am not a person who frightens easily, and I am not someone who exaggerates. I'm 31 years old. I did 2 years of community college, and I have been working night shifts in industrial facilities since I was 19. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the kind of person who is sitting here telling you this story, and I want you to understand that it took something genuinely disturbing to make me feel the way I'm about to describe. It started small, the way these things apparently always do. About 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday night, I was logging a late delivery from one of our regular carriers, a refrigerated truck out of a regional dairy distributor. The driver, a heavy-set guy named Sal, who I'd seen maybe 30 times, backed his truck up to Dock 7, and we did the usual handoff. Scanned the manifest, verified the pallet count, signed off. Sal drove away at 12:47 a.m., standard. Completely standard. The thing that wasn't standard happened maybe 40 minutes later when I walked back out to Dock 7 to retrieve a clipboard I'd left on the edge of the bay. The dock door was still open. I hadn't latched it yet, and when I shone my flashlight out across the loading apron, I noticed something that made me stop walking. There was a single footprint in the grease residue on the concrete at the edge of the bay. Not a work boot print, a bare foot, an adult bare foot, facing inward, pointing into the building. I stood there for probably 10 seconds. I swept my flashlight left and right across the emptied parking apron. The lot was empty. No vehicles, no movement, nothing. I went back inside, latched the dock door, and told myself one of the day crew must have walked out there barefoot. For some reason I couldn't imagine. People do weird things. I wrote it off. I thought about it a few times over the next couple of days, the way you think about something that doesn't quite compute. But I had deliveries to process, and it was just a footprint, so I let it go. The second thing happened the following Thursday. We have a receiving office at the north end of the dock corridor. It's a glass-walled room elevated about 4 feet above the dock floor on a platform with a clear sight line down the full length of the bay. I can see all 8 dock doors from my desk. It's a fishbowl, which I normally like because it means I can keep eyes on everything without leaving my chair. At around 2:15 a.m., I was updating the inventory system when I noticed one of the dock doors at the far end of the corridor, Dock 1, which hadn't received any deliveries that night, was sitting about 8 inches open, not fully open, just slightly, enough to let in a narrow strip of cold air and the ambient orange glow of the parking lot lights. I distinctly remembered latching that door during my 1 a.m. walkthrough because the latch mechanism on Dock 1 is stiff and I'd had to put weight behind it. I would not have forgotten leaving it open. I went down, latched it again, came back to the office. I told myself the latch was faulty. I made a note to report it to maintenance. I did not sleep well the next morning, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. A week passed without anything notable. I'd almost entirely let it go. Then the third thing happened, and after the third thing, I couldn't let anything go anymore. It was a Monday, about 3:30 in the morning. I was alone. My co-receiver had called out sick, which happened often enough that I didn't think twice about it. The last truck of the night had been processed, and I was midway through my end-of-shift documentation when the motion sensor light in the freezer corridor clicked on. The freezer corridor is a 50-foot hallway that connects the main dock area to the back freezer unit. It runs along the west interior wall of the building. The motion sensor back there is sensitive. It trips for rats sometimes, or when the air compressor's cycling creates enough draft to flutter a loose plastic strip in the doorway. So when I saw the light come on in the freezer corridor on camera, I made a note of it and kept working. Then the light went off. Then it came on again. On, off, 5 times in 3 minutes. I watched it happen on my monitor. There was nothing visually wrong in the corridor. The camera showed an empty hallway with a concrete floor and bare walls, and the plastic curtain strips at the far end swaying slightly. But something was triggering that sensor, something with enough mass and heat signature to activate a commercial-grade motion unit, doing it in a pattern that was too regular to be a draft. I picked up my radio and did something I'm slightly embarrassed about. I didn't call my supervisor. I called my wife. I don't know why exactly. I think I wanted to hear a normal voice before I had to go back there. She told me to call my supervisor, which was the correct answer. I told her I was sure it was nothing and that I'd call her back in 20 minutes. I walked the freezer corridor with a flashlight and my radio clipped to my belt. The corridor was empty. The plastic curtain strips at the far end were still. The freezer unit beyond them was locked, as it should have been. I stood at the entrance to the freezer for about 30 seconds, listening. The only sound was the refrigeration compressors, a deep rhythmic thudding that I'd long since stopped registering consciously, but which, in that moment, felt like it was masking other sounds. I walked back toward the office. When I was about halfway down the corridor, I heard something that stopped me completely. It was a sound like slow exhaled breath, just once, coming from the direction of the freezer behind me. I turned around. My flashlight showed an empty corridor. The plastic strips were still. I stood there for what was probably 20 seconds. It felt like 5 minutes, and there was nothing else. No second breath, no movement. I went back to the office and did not return to the freezer corridor for the rest of my shift. I called my supervisor the next morning and told him about the motion sensor and the dock door. He said he'd have maintenance check the sensor calibration and the latch on Dock 1. He sounded like he was half awake, which he probably was. He said if anything else came up, to call the on-call line. Nothing happened for 5 days. I started sleeping normally again. Then, 11 days ago, I arrived for my shift and found something on the loading apron outside Dock 7 that I have been unable to explain and am still unable to stop thinking about. It was a grocery receipt, one of ours, printed on our register stock with our facility store code header at the top. I know because I looked it up in the system. The receipt was from a transaction logged at 3:54 a.m. 6 nights prior. I had been working that night. I had not processed a transaction at 3:54 a.m. There was no delivery on our manifest for that window. The receipt listed one item. It wasn't a product we carry. The description field, where a product name should have printed, read, "I am in here every night." I stood on the loading apron holding that receipt for a long time. The morning sun was coming up over the tree line to the east, and the parking lot was empty and clean and completely ordinary looking, and I was holding a receipt from our own system describing something that should have been impossible. I called the on-call line immediately. My supervisor drove in. We called building security. They reviewed 6 weeks of exterior camera footage over the following 2 days, focusing on overnight windows. What they found or didn't find was somehow worse than finding something. No unauthorized entries. No vehicles in the lot during the relevant windows. No persons visible on any exterior camera that couldn't be accounted for. The facility manager told me the receipt was likely a system error, a corrupted print job from a data hiccup. He seemed genuinely to believe this. He explained it in a patient, reasonable way that made complete sense while he was speaking. I nodded and agreed with him. Then I drove home and changed the locks on my house. I'm still working the shift. I need the job. But I've started keeping the lights on at full power in every section I'm working in, which is apparently a minor violation of our energy conservation protocols, and I have received one written notice about it. I don't care about the written notice. The thing that keeps me from sleeping, the thing that my wife can't quite understand the depth of no matter how many times I try to explain it. It's not the receipt specifically. It's the last 6 weeks viewed through the lens of the receipt. The footprint, the door 8 inches open, the motion sensor, the sound I heard in the freezer corridor. If that receipt is real, and I believe it is, then someone has been accessing that building in a way that leaves no trace on any external camera. Every single night for at least 6 weeks. And they know the building well enough to use the register system. And they know it well enough to leave me a message. And they've been there every night that I've been there. I don't know who it is. I don't know what they want. The police took a report and said they'd be in touch, which so far has meant exactly nothing. The only other thing I'll say is this. Last Wednesday, I was conducting my 3 a.m. walkthrough along the dock corridor when I noticed something I hadn't registered consciously until I was back in the office reviewing it in my head. On the dusty surface of a support beam near Dock 4, someone had written 3 words with their finger. Still here. Good night. I handed in my 2 weeks' notice the next morning. I'm working out the last 4 days. I'm counting. I worked front desk at a mid-range hotel for almost 2 years, handling the overnight shift from midnight to 8 a.m. I took the job right after my divorce finalized, and I needed something that would let me not think too much. Night shifts are good for that. The world is slower, the demands are smaller, and there's a particular silence at 3 a.m. in a hotel lobby. The marble, and the elevator music and the small fountain near the entrance, all contributing to this sealed-off, pressurized feeling like being inside a snow globe that I found genuinely calming. For the first 9 months, nothing unusual happened. Occasionally, a guest would come down for extra towels or to complain about a neighbor's noise. Once a month or so, someone would come in clearly drunk, and I'd have to navigate that. But mostly it was me, the lobby, the ambient music, and 12 hours of the same rotating playlist of jazz standards that I eventually learned to stop hearing entirely. The hotel had 6 floors, 112 rooms, and a basement level that contained a laundry facility, a mechanical room, and storage. The basement was accessed by staff elevator only, using a key card. Guests couldn't go down there. I had access because occasionally there were laundry requests on overnight, and I was the only staff member on site between 1 and 5 a.m. when housekeeping wasn't running. My name is Carol. I'm 38, and I have worked enough overnight shifts in enough different settings that I would describe myself as a professionally calm person. I'm telling you this because the thing I'm about to describe is the first time in my adult life that I have been genuinely, viscerally frightened in a work setting, and I want that baseline to mean something to you. It started with the calls. About 4 months before I left the job, I began receiving internal calls at the front desk from room 114. Our phone system displayed the originating room number on the front desk screen, so I always knew where a call was coming from. Room 114 was a standard king on the first floor, accessible from a side corridor that connected to the lobby. The calls would come in at irregular hours, usually between 2 and 4 a.m., and they were always the same. I would answer, give my standard greeting, and there would be silence. Not dead silence. There was a quality to it, like a room full of air rather than a disconnected line. Ambient room silence. Someone not speaking rather than no one there. I would say hello a few times. I would ask if they needed anything. Silence. After about 30 seconds, the line would click off. The first few times, I assumed it was accidental, a guest rolling over in bed and bumping the phone, a child playing with the receiver. When it kept happening, I started checking the occupancy logs to see who was in 114 on nights when the calls came in. Over the next 3 weeks, I logged 8 calls from room 114. On 5 of those nights, the room was occupied by different unrelated guests. On 3 of those nights, room 114 was empty, unoccupied. No keycard issued. Dark. On one of those 3 nights, I walked down the first floor corridor to room 114 after a call. I knocked. No answer. I used my master key to open the door a few inches. The room was dark and cold. We dropped the HVAC on unoccupied rooms to save energy, and completely empty. Bed made, curtains drawn, everything exactly as housekeeping leaves it. I stood there for a moment in the doorway with the hall light behind me, casting a wedge of light across the carpet. Nothing. I went back to the desk and wrote it up in the incident log as a probable system fault, and put in a maintenance request for the phone in 114. Maintenance checked it. The phone was functioning normally. The calls continued. I want to be accurate about my emotional state through this period. I was unsettled, not frightened. There was a rational explanation I hadn't found yet. I kept looking for it. The second element started about 3 weeks after the calls began. I noticed that the service elevator to the basement was arriving at the lobby level on its own. I would be at the desk, and I'd hear the elevator chime and the doors would open, and I'd look up expecting a guest, and the elevator would be empty. It happened 4 times over 2 weeks. The 4th time, I walked over and stood in the elevator doorway, holding the doors open with my arm, and looked down at the floor panel. The B button, basement, was dark. No call had come from the basement. The elevator had simply arrived. The service elevator's mechanical room was in the basement. If someone was operating the elevator from the basement level using a call button, it would register. If someone was inside the elevator car pressing the lobby button, it would register. There was no malfunction explanation that involved the elevator arriving with no corresponding button press. I wrote this up too. Maintenance found nothing wrong. I started taking the stairs to the basement on laundry runs. The thing that changed the texture of everything, the thing that recontextualized all of it in a way I genuinely didn't want, happened about 5 weeks after the calls began. I was doing a routine 3 a.m. walk of the first floor corridor, a habit I'd developed over months. Room 114's door was closed, and the room was unoccupied that night. When I walked past it, something made me stop. I don't know what exactly. Not a sound. More of a change in air pressure, the kind of thing you feel when a door that's been closed in a warm room has recently been opened. A residual difference. I put my hand flat against room 114's door. The door was cold. Colder than it should have been even with the HVAC dialed down. Like the window was open. I opened the door with my master key. The room was dark. The curtains were open. They had been closed during my last check. And through the window, which faced the parking lot, the orange glow of the street lights was coming in. The window itself was closed and locked. I stood in the doorway for a long time, running my flashlight slowly across the room. Nothing was physically different except the curtains. Open curtains in an empty room, cold door. An open window would explain the cold, but the window was locked. A colder HVAC setting would explain the cold, but not the curtains. I didn't go into the room. I pulled the door closed and walked back to the desk and sat down and spent a while being honest with myself about whether I was frightened. I decided I was. The following week, a guest in room 116, the room adjacent to 114, called the desk at 3:30 a.m. to complain about noise from next door. Banging, she said. A rhythmic knocking like someone hitting the wall from inside the room. She had been asleep, and it had woken her up. Room 114 was unoccupied. I called my night manager. He drove in from home, which was a 20-minute drive. When he arrived, we went to room 114 together. We opened the door, went inside, turned on all the lights. Nothing. The room was exactly as it should have been. The guest in 116 said the noise had stopped about 10 minutes before we'd arrived, which was roughly when I'd called the manager, which was roughly when I would have first gone to investigate. That timing has bothered me ever since. My manager filed a noise complaint form out of protocol, noted source unverified, and went home. He suggested the guest may have been a light sleeper reacting to pipes or Eva key. He was not unkind about it, but I could tell he thought the issue was primarily a matter of my nerves, and I had been alone on overnight long enough to be susceptible to that. I didn't say what I was actually thinking. I didn't say that the noise stopping when I called him felt deliberate, that something in room 114 might have heard the phone call and responded to it, that the calls from that room, the elevator, the curtains, the cold door, taken together, described something that had been in that building for months, moving through its spaces undetected, calling me from empty rooms at 3 a.m. and watching whether I came to look. I put in my notice the following week. I told them I'd found another position, which was a lie. I needed to leave, and I needed a face-saving reason for leaving. I have not been back. What I can't stop thinking about, and this is the thing that still wakes me up at night, sometimes is the first floor corridor, the way room 114 sits at the end of it, the way the corridor is just long enough that, standing at the lobby entrance, you can't quite see whether 114's door is open or closed in the low overnight lighting. For 18 months, I walked that corridor alone at 3 a.m. For at least some of those months, I now believe something was in that room. And the thing that I keep coming back to, the thing I can't logic my way out of, is this. On the nights when the room was occupied by regular guests, and the calls still came in, those guests were asleep in that room. And they never reported anything, and I kept sending them there. I don't know what that means. I've decided I'd rather not know. I drove long-haul delivery for a regional freight company for 3 years, and before I tell you what happened, I want you to understand the texture of that kind of work, because it matters to the story. You spend a lot of time alone, not just the physical aloneness of being in a cab for 12 or 14 hours, but a mental kind of alone, roads that don't change, exits that blur together, radio signals that fade in and out between stations, and the particular flatness that sets in around 2 a.m. when the caffeine is losing and the miles aren't. You spend enough time in that state and you develop a very precise relationship with normal. You know what the road is supposed to feel like. You know what your own mind does when it's tired. You trust that calibration. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that when I tell you something was wrong, I mean I knew it in the same way I know a tire is pulling or a brake is soft. Not a feeling, a calibration. My name is Nathan. I was 29 when this happened. I was running a Tuesday-Thursday overnight freight route from a distribution hub outside of Columbus to a regional depot in a small city, about 220 miles southwest. Departed 11 p.m., arrived between 4 and 5 a.m. depending on load and traffic. I'd driven it maybe 60 times. I knew every mile of that road. The first strange thing, and when I say strange, I mean strange the way a road you've driven 100 times looking slightly different is strange. A wrongness you can't immediately name happened about 4 months before everything came to a head. I was maybe 80 miles into the route, which puts me on a state highway stretch that runs through a flat agricultural corridor. No towns for 20 miles in either direction. Sparse tree lines on either side of the road, and beyond them, fields. It's one of the loneliest stretches of the route, and I'd driven it so many times I barely registered it anymore. At approximately 1:20 a.m., my CB crackled. I ran Channel 19 out of habit. Most long haulers do on secondary routes, just for the occasional traffic report or courtesy call from another driver. But at that hour on that road, you almost never hear anything. The crackle wasn't unusual. What came out of it was a voice, male, calm, medium pitch. And it said very clearly and distinctly, "Blue Peterbilt on Route 35. I can see your lights." I was driving a blue Peterbilt. I was on Route 35. I picked up the CB and said what you say, which is who's calling, or some version of it. I asked who was out there, what their 20 was, the standard back and forth. Nothing. The channel was quiet. I watched my mirrors. No headlights behind me. No lights anywhere in that corridor except mine and the stars. I told myself it was another driver. There were other blue Peterbilts. Route 35 covered more distance than just my corridor. The signal could have carried. I told myself this with the specific conviction of a person who has decided to believe something. I got to the depot, offloaded, made the return run, drove home, slept. And I might have let it go entirely, except that it happened again. 3 weeks later, same route, same approximate location, same window of time. A few minutes after 1 a.m., the CB crackled, and the same voice said, "Saw you go by last week. You always run this time." I sat up straight in that cab like someone had poured cold water down my neck. Same calm voice. Same quality to it. No truck noise behind it, no road noise, none of the ambient rumble that's always present when a driver is calling from a moving vehicle. It was clean, like a call from a stationary position. I didn't respond this time. I just drove. I watched every turnout, every field access road, every gap in the tree line as I passed. Nothing. No vehicles parked. No lights. Whoever was transmitting was either very far away with a powerful enough rig to reach me clearly, or they were close and not visible. For the next 2 months, I drove that route with the CB on Channel 19, and nothing else happened. I added 30 minutes to my pre-departure checks, walking the truck's exterior more carefully than I needed to. I don't know what I was looking for. I kept driving. The money was good, the route was familiar, and I am a stubborn person by nature. Then the calls started. Not on the CB, on my personal cell phone. It was a Friday morning, which was unusual because I didn't run Fridays. My route was Tuesday through Thursday. I was home, awake, having coffee at around 9 a.m. when my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. Area code I didn't know. I answered because I sometimes get calls from dispatch about schedule changes. The voice on the other end was the same voice from the CB. He said, "You almost stopped at the Shell station on Route 35 last Tuesday. I was watching to see if you would." I felt the coffee cup in my hand, and I felt the table under my arm, and I felt the ordinary morning around me, and all of it had suddenly gone very far away. There is a Shell station at mile marker 94 on Route 35. I had pulled into the lot at around 1 a.m. last Tuesday to check my phone and stretch my legs, and I had sat there for about 4 minutes before deciding I wasn't that tired and pulling back onto the road. I had not gotten out of the truck. I had not seen another vehicle in that lot or on the road. I said, "Who is this?" I said it maybe 3 times. The line was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should take 35 a different way next week. I think you know that." And he hung up. I called my company's safety line. They took the information and said they'd pass it to their security liaison. They did not call me back. I went to the local police department. The officer who took my report was professional and not dismissive, but he was also candid. An unidentified caller with no clear criminal act attached to the call put this in a gray area. They would note it. If something escalated, his word escalated, which implied a specific picture of escalation that I did not want to examine too closely, I should call immediately. I took 2 weeks off, told my dispatcher I had a family situation, and spent most of it in my house trying to think clearly about the geometry of what had happened. Someone had watched me park at that Shell station at 1 a.m. They had been positioned in a location that gave them sight lines to my truck without being visible from inside the cab. They had my cell phone number, which was not publicly listed. They had been tracking my schedule closely enough to know my route days and my approximate timing. This was not opportunistic. This was months of observation. I went back to work. I know how that sounds. I had rent, a truck payment, and a life that didn't offer me a lot of alternative income at short notice. I took 35 the way he'd suggested avoiding, going north on County Road 18 and reconnecting with a highway at a later mile marker, adding about 15 minutes to my route. I told myself this was pragmatism. It was fear, straightforward fear, and I knew it. 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday just past 1 a.m., I was in that agricultural corridor. New route, different road, when my CB crackled again. The voice said, "I know you switched routes. I'm on this one too." I did not respond. I drove the next 50 miles at 8 over the speed limit, and I did not stop for anything, and I held the steering wheel with both hands, and I watched every shadow in the tree lines along that road. I have taken a local delivery position now. I work days. I haven't been on an overnight highway route in 6 weeks. My cell phone number is different. I still check the CB when I'm in the truck, not because I want to hear anything, because the silence at least tells me where I stand. Last week on a Wednesday morning, my new number rang. Unknown area code. I let it go to voicemail. There was no message. There was never a message, but the call lasted for 43 seconds.